Yes, I'd like to introduce Ben Allen. He's a research director at the Institute of European Environmental Policy, and he's been involved in the designing process of parts of the EU taxonomy. So really look forward to hear some insights. Welcome, Ben, and thank you for being here.
As Ricarda said, I've been involved in the development of the EU taxonomy specifically for the past 4 years. And at the very beginning of the process, advising on criteria for climate change, and particularly related to the land using sectors, and more recently for the last 2 years as the co-rapporteur of the technical working group of the platform on sustainable finance. And just because this came up in the icebreaker, I'll say this now, that work of the platform was to recommend criteria for the taxonomy to the Commission. It's an independent expert group. So we had a role in developing sustainability performance standards for different economic activities of the economy that form the part of the taxonomy. I'm saying that now because it's not something I go into in a lot of detail, but it might come up in the Q&A at the end. So I think that's the reason I'm here, to give a bit of an insight into that process. And some of the questions that we were asked to cover in preparing for this were basically, what is the taxonomy? What does it try and do? Why does it exist? And what are the implications of it? But I'm going to frame that in a broader context, just to really try and bring home what the purpose of this taxonomy is. And I'm going to start with two different messages. The first one comes from the IPCC's 6th assessment report. Try and say that really fast. IPCC 6th assessment report, which came out this year. And the executive summary for policymakers includes a couple of statements. There's a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And the choices and actions implemented in this decade will have impacts now and for thousands of years. For thousands of years. And it's quite scary, really, to think about what we're not doing now and the actions that we need to take and the implications of that. And they go on to say further in the report itself, unless we make deep, rapid and sustained cuts to emissions now, even if we do that, it's still going to be a couple of decades before we start to see a reduction in temperatures. So the trajectory of climate change will continue at least for a couple of decades, even if we act rapidly in a very sustained way and do everything we can at this point. It's quite sobering. It's quite a depressing start for a presentation, but there is a reason for this. The second piece of information is from the European Environment Agency's State and Outlook report. This was done in 2020, where they take a view across all the environmental indicators in Europe, and they make an assessment. What's going on? How's it looking? What's the future looking like in this context? Is it in a good path? Is it in a bad path? And again, the message is pretty stark, and it's quite noticeable in reports that are coming out now from these big institutions that the language has changed from one of we're not quite sure what's going on to being quite determined. You know, these things are not happening and we need to act. And it says that Europe will not achieve its 2030 goals without urgent action during the next decade to address the alarming rate of biodiversity loss, the increasing impacts of climate change, and the overconsumption of natural resources. So again, it's a pretty stark message. And the reason I mention these two things is one's obviously about climate, one's obviously about broader environment and biodiversity. And it's precisely this that the EU taxonomy is designed to try and address, is to try and turn around some of these trends through the way that we target finance, through the way that we signpost investments to say, this is sustainable, these are the things that you need to invest in, and these are going to contribute to our goals. The finance element of it is a key part, because you could say, well, surely all environmental policies are focused on doing these things. All the climate policies, the commitments that we're making are going to be focused on addressing some of these challenges. Yes, they are, but here's a figure for you, 177 billion euros per year, huge figure. Actually, it's a figure you can't really keep in your head. You can imagine the price of a car, or perhaps the price of a house, or a price of a pint of beer, but 177 billion euros is such a huge figure. And what this is the gap between what we currently spend through the public purse to address our climate and energy targets, just our climate and energy targets. It's the gap between what we spend now and what we need to spend in order to actually meet them. So when we talk about making these deep, rapid and sustained cuts to emissions, we talk about addressing and reversing the loss of biodiversity. These are the sorts of figures that we're talking about you need from additional investments. And again, the purpose of the taxonomy is to say, okay, financial institutions, large businesses, large corporations, we will define what is sustainable and in order to shift the focus of finance in that direction. And I'll go on to a little bit of detail about precisely what it's doing and how it's doing it. I thought it was useful, though, also to say that it all sounds very stark, very, very bad news. We've got a huge gap to fill. But if we do act, then we start to see huge savings. But we'll start with inaction. If we don't do anything, we have this bill per year, we have this huge gap. We're seeing the impacts of this now, floods, drought, heat waves, etc. If we don't do anything now, we just continue with the policies that we've got, the cost of it actually goes up. And estimates vary, but 4% of GDP by 2100. The cost of flooding alone rises from 5 billion a year to 20 billion a year. Again, if we just continue doing the same things that we're doing, implementing the policies that we've got. So that 177 billion figure grows, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger the less we do. But if we start acting, the savings are massive. So 48 to 99 billion can be saved by 2050 just with air quality benefits alone because of the impact they have on human health and the costs of that to society. So by acting, by shifting finance, by focusing it, using tools like the taxonomy, we not only divert finance, but we also save the cost and expenditure related to all these impacts. So taxonomy itself, it's an odd piece of legislation. I mean, it's an odd wording for a policy tool. It is basically a signposting tool to help change direction of financial investments and how to judge if an activity is contributing sustainably to a given environmental objective. I'll go through what those are. And to avoid significant harm, and to safeguard human rights and social safeguards. What do we mean by activity? Well, an activity is how we break down the whole economy into manageable pieces. So an activity might be something like growing of a crop, it might be the manufacturing of a car, it might be construction of a building. And for each of these activities, what the taxonomy tries to do is says, okay, you're building this activity of constructing a building. What would you need to do in that process in order to be considered sustainable for a given objective? How can the pursuit of that activity contribute substantially to climate change? How can it contribute substantially to biodiversity? And it's these criteria, these performance standards that are developed in the taxonomy to then help benchmark and check investments. So if someone wants to call their investments green, prior to the taxonomy, there's no real way of sort of benchmarking that, or at least there were a whole series of different ways of doing it, and no one really had clarity on what sustainability meant. Hence the taxonomy. It comes in and says, okay, universally, this is what we mean by sustainable in the context of the taxonomy. This is what a substantial contribution to climate looks like for this activity. The overall intention is to have this list for all of the sectors of the economy, but of course, that's a huge, huge operation. So it's being built in pieces as we go along. So it's basically a big list, performance criteria, saying what you need to do, what is considered sustainable. So if you're investing, if you're a large institution and you're actually operating some of these activities, in order to consider yourself or call yourself green or sustainable, qualify for sustainable finance, you need to meet these criteria. It's a big challenge. I mentioned there's 6 environmental objectives that are the focus of this, and they are climate mitigation and adaptation, circular economy, pollution prevention and control, water and marine resources, and biodiversity and ecosystems. They make up the 6 environmental objectives that are written into the legislation, which is the Taxonomy Regulation. At the moment, in law, we have criteria, technical screening criteria for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Those were developed now. They've finalized the development of those in 2020, and they came into law in 2021. So we have those criteria. So companies can report against these criteria and say, I am making a substantial contribution towards climate change mitigation or adaptation, or at least they know what they need to do in order to do that. For the other 4 objectives, that's what we've been working on in the last 4 years in the platform on sustainable finance. Well, what do these performance criteria look like for a range of different economic activities? That independent expert group, the platform, made recommendations in November last year and in March last year. So there's 2 sets. Those went to the Commission, and the Commission have just, in the past 3 weeks, released for public consultation the Delegated Act, which contains these criteria. So if you're really interested and you want to have your say on what these criteria are, whether they're good or not, whether they need to be changed, there is a public consultation running right now. I think it closes next week. And that will establish, if the Commission adopts that Delegated Act after the consultation, that will then establish that list for these other 4 objectives. It still needs to be ratified by the Parliament and the Council, but that will complete then the set of 6 environmental objectives that enter into law for some of the activities in our economy. Obviously not all of them. We had to start somewhere, but some of them. So building up this list of criteria by which you can benchmark and check your activities to help you know what sustainable is, to shift those financial investments to address these big priority issues that we have in society and in our economy. Only 2 more slides. I've mentioned that we had to start somewhere. So there is a prioritization exercise that goes on to say, well, which activities do we start on? Where do we start in this picture? Looking at the whole economy, everything that gets operated under the economy, not just in the EU, this applies globally. Where do we start? So for the Climate Delegated Act, the climate activities, an exercise was run to prioritize them on the basis of the amount of emissions that they contribute. So what's happened is the intention in the Climate Delegated Act is to cover the activities that are responsible for over 90% of Europe's greenhouse gas emissions. So the big emitting sectors, energy is obviously a huge one, transport's a big one, agriculture and forestry are significant ones, and so on and so forth. Obviously, that doesn't mean we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 90%. It just means that we are addressing those sectors that are responsible for 90% of those emissions. So the investments, the sustainable finance, the directing of sustainability performance to those sectors helps shift them from being significantly emitting sectors to substantially contributing in some way to mitigation. That's the intention. Excuse me. Because this is only supposed to be short and we've obviously got Q&A, I'll stop there with the taxonomy part, because I wanted to mention one of the questions that was asked for speakers was, well, what does this mean going forwards? What does this mean for the future of industry? What does this mean for jobs? What kind of jobs are going to be available as a result of this? And I think we're already starting to see this. If you look at LinkedIn jobs and things like that, you see much more of a focus on sustainability or reporting or ESG, environment, social and governance roles in different organizations, because they will be required to report against these criteria, not just through the taxonomy, but through the broader sustainable finance package and what that requires. And it's going to require a lot more knowledge, a lot more skills and understanding in these different organizations, a lot more advice being provided, because now they're having to say, well, what's the impact of our organization, not just on profits and our own business, but what impact does it have on the environment? And what are we doing about that? And that's new for a great many companies. So there's going to be a lot more jobs in that space. There's going to be a lot more need for support to develop bits of policy. I can tell you now that working on the platform and with the Commission teams that were working on that with us, which we were working for, they're still a relatively small team. To try and address all these questions in the economy, it's going to require a huge amount of effort going forwards. So hopefully there's a bit of positive news out at the end of it. It is there, it is being developed, it is starting to make requirements binding on finance institutions, large businesses, and there should be a future in sustainable jobs, one would hope.